Good afternoon. I hate to interrupt conversations because that's kind of what the day's about, right? But I know our church is putting on the community dinner and people are going to start arriving not too far down the line. So we want to welcome everyone. For those who may not yet know, although I think everybody in the room probably does at this point, Joy and I are finishing up probably this month our time as temporary co-pastors here at Victor, and delighted to participate in this 225th anniversary of the founding of the congregation. So we're kind of, that's an added piece to our role of transitioning, help the congregation going from the past to 225 years of it, to more recent years of it for those who are here, and on to maybe in a week or so we'll know who your next pastor is going to be for sure. So it's an exciting time. I am just MC. This is an informal kind of time. We're not having a service or anything like that. So I'm MC. I am the MC. I will call people up one at a time. And I asked Joy if she wanted to say anything, and she didn't know, but
I was told to.
But I bet she does. So, Joy.
And I need to apologize because I haven't done some of the work I'm supposed to do, so I'm going to have to sneak out. So, one of the things that I have said over and over again is, we're not young, and between the two of us, we have about 100 years of pastoral ministry, and we agree that this is the church we've most enjoyed. So pat yourselves on the back. Yeah, you really are great. And so if you need references, I'd be glad to write them. But we're very grateful for this time we've had with you. And I don't know if you know how this came about. I'm going to brag a bit. I was sitting over here one morning. I suppose Jimmy was preaching, and no, he's not boring. But I looked over there and I did the math. And I went, this is their 225th year. And I said to a few people, it is? So I'm really, really glad that that was embraced. And it's important to me, and I am preaching tomorrow, so that you may want to stay home or come. But my sermon title is A Push from Behind and a Pull from Ahead. 225 years of saints, right? What a push from behind. And then there's the pull from ahead. And Jimmy and I have been fortunate enough to be in this interstitial place as this transition goes on. And so we're so thrilled, and just know you have our vote of confidence, and we will not be your pastors, but we'll always care about you. So glad that all of you can come, and I apologize that I need to go somewhere else. And does anyone have a pair of reading glasses on them? Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm quite sure that people in 1798 had no idea what 2023 was going to be like, right? And we have no idea what things are going to be like 225 years from now, whatever year that is. Star Trek days, I think. But a couple of weeks ago, I challenged the congregation, and as we listen to stories and memories of the past here in the next half hour or so, keep in mind, too, where will the church be 25 years from now, or 50 years from now? Don't look 225, but look ahead a little bit. A lot of the people who are in this congregation right now will be here 25 years from now, 50 years from now. Some of you were just remembering the story of the mouse falling from the chandelier when you were like 9 or 10 years old, and here you are. So we're not going to do the math, but I'll bet that was a couple years ago, right? So just think about the people right now who are going to be the leaders of this congregation in another 25 years. Pray for them now. What we're going to do now is call up one by one folks who have been here, mostly folks who have been here over the years, to come and say whatever they would like. Val Fowler there he is, was forever, I don't know, stated clerk of the Presbytery, pastored several Presbyterian churches, and his family's been involved in this church. So Val, come and say whatever you would like.
Thanks, Jimmy. Well, I was both surprised and honored to be asked to be a part of this. My connection of the church is not as a pastor, but it began as a friend of your pastor. Alan and I became very friendly, became friends probably at the first Presbyterian meeting I attended after moving here in 1990, and this church has been a part of that time. So I can say happy quasquibicentennial, to be official about it. And I did some thinking that when I was born, this church was already 152 years old. When my hometown of Amarillo, Texas was founded, the church was 73 years old. And when I was ordained, this congregation was 177 years old. It kind of puts into perspective, it's almost like what I said to a group of high school kids about 6 months ago when we were talking, and I said, I'm going to warn you about something when you become my age. It's sobering to realize that your entire life is the last 2 chapters of the current history book. Well, this congregation's entire life is all but the first 2 or 3 chapters of the current American history book. And there's something to be said for that. And one observation I would make is when I moved here in 1990, I had previously served 3 churches, and all of them were relatively young. The first church I served was in its 89th year. The next 2 churches were less than 25 years old when I became their pastor. When I moved here to serve Chilai, the Chilai church was getting ready to celebrate its 175th anniversary. And during the first kind of crisis that we had after I became pastor, I found myself saying to the session, we've been here 175 years. If this crisis brings us to our knees, this crisis isn't the problem. You've been here 225 years. Whatever crisis might face you, if that crisis brings this church to its knees, that crisis isn't the problem. You have a long history of building through and living through highs and lows, things that lift us up and things that bring us to our knees, and you're still here. One of the things about our faith is our faith lasts. It does for us as individuals, and it does for us as communities. When this church was 8 years old, which means in human terms it was 3rd grade, 1816 came around. In August of 1816, Albany was shut down by a 20-inch snowstorm. From February of 1816 through a year and a half later, there was measurable snow every single month of the year. In 1816 and 17, crops utterly failed in western New York. It was a very, very hard time. There were 9 churches in this presbytery that were founded in 1816. This church was already a whopping 8 years old, and you're still here. I find it comforting to say even to myself, if I'm going through something difficult, I've been around 74 years. If this crisis brings me to my knees, this crisis isn't the problem. And it draws me back to looking at what it is that we are as human beings, individually and together in ministry especially. That there is something that lasts, and there's always something that brings us through. So I would commend celebrating that part of 225 years. I like what Jimmy just said. You can think back even 50 years and think, you might have to look at the records to see who was on the session 50 years ago. And what about the history since then makes you grateful that those people were in leadership 50 years ago? What are you doing right now that would make people 50 years from now be grateful that you were fulfilling the role you're fulfilling today on their behalf? So that's another perspective of age that is just powerful. Where I grew up, history is much closer than it is here. In 1974, I was working in the northernmost town of Texas, Perryton, Texas, and I met a woman who was in one of the nursing homes who came to Ochiltree County when she was 1 year old. She was 94 years old, which meant that she was born in 1884. And she confirmed that she came to her home as an infant in a covered wagon. I could speak to a person who came in a covered wagon to the area where we were living. I met a man in my second church who was 104 years old and had lived in the eastern Oklahoma area since he was 4 years old. He's the only true Sooner I've ever met. He was in the wagon that his parents used to jump the gun to get land before everyone else did. He was a member of the Oklahoma Provisional Legislature. He was a member of the first state legislature in Oklahoma. And I said to him, "Man, you've seen some changes all your life." He said, "Yep." And I was against every damn one of them. Please don't be that way. But there's something about age that is good to remember. There are a lot of things that have attempted to eradicate Christianity from the world, but in 2,000 years they haven't succeeded. Because there are things that last. Kindness, generosity, love. Nothing can destroy those. Nothing can take those away. I think one of the greatest things about this church, and those of you who have heard me preach over the last few years have heard me say that I think a gift to this world right now is the tagline for this church. Whoever you are, however you came here, you are welcome in this place. We are living in an unwelcoming world. There are people actively trying to limit how welcoming that people can be. And yet, here is a church that has the courage to say and place on every piece of paper that goes out or into a hand on Sunday morning, whoever you are, however you came here, you are welcome in this place. I don't know who created that. Where it came from, I don't need to know. But I, for one, can say thank you. Because it's a gift not only to this church, but to this world in which we live. And right now, our world needs that. Our world needs what a friend of mine once said very recently, fearless kindness. Not brave, fearless kindness. Be fearlessly kind. I saw a picture of the main church in Iceland. I hope to be able to walk this one day because the picture was a frontal picture of that huge church, which is the single tallest building in all of Reykjavik. And travelers who have been there have told me this thing I'm going to describe is more than a football field long. It's the sidewalk to the front doors of the church. It's painted as a rainbow. You walk the rainbow to get into the church. I had a dream driving over here just now. Wouldn't it be cool if the Victor Church had a rainbow coming up its sidewalk? If every Presbyterian church in America could have a rainbow come into its sidewalk. Welcome to all. You've come a long way as a church. God has brought us a long way. But the truth is you're living now. And you're as faithful now as you ever will be. I'm going to end with a song that was sent to me by a folk friend the day before my birthday. And it touched me so that I went right into the front room, pulled out my guitar, and played it until I had learned it. I used to be back there, soon I'll be somewhere, but for the moment I'm here. I don't have a map, but I can steer. Sometimes I feel down, sometimes I feel up, but all of the time I feel, and that's how I know it's real. Oh, seize the day, squeeze every minute from the hour. Don't let a second slip away. Use it, you have the power. Oh, seize the day. Try it with me. Oh, seize the day. Squeeze every minute from the hour. Oh, seize the day. Squeeze every minute from the hour. Don't let a second slip away. Use it, you have the power. Oh, seize the day. From the moment of my birth to the moment of my death, it's such a fragile piece of time. And it's the only thing I can call mine. Yesterday I was young, tomorrow I'll be old, but for the day this age is fine. But for this today this age will do. But for if I don't have a guitar in my hand, I lose the words. But for this day, this age will do, and from this perspective, each day is new. Oh, seize the day. Oh, seize the day. Squeeze every minute from the hour. Don't let a second slip away. Use it, you have the power. Oh, seize the day. I used to be back there, soon I'll be somewhere, but for the moment I'm here. And now in this moment, all is clear.
Thanks so much, Val. Someone who's just beginning the journey of ministry here in this church, so not representing the history of this church, but in some sense the future. Alfred Apaya is a graduate student at Yale. Come on, Alfred. And this church is sponsoring him as a candidate for ministry in this presbytery. So, Alfred?
Greetings, everyone. I was very happy when I received the note to give a short speech. And I'm excited to see everyone today. It's amazing and wonderful that I could see so many people and also some familiar faces. So, greetings. It has been an incredible journey for me and my family over the past 3 years being part of this wonderful congregation. When we first walked through these doors, we weren't sure what to expect because when Jennifer moved to Farmington from Ghana and I was in Georgia, in 2019 I came to Georgia to start my MDiv. And we married in Ghana, I think, on the 10th of August. Then I came to the U.S. on the 17th. So I came to Georgia and Jennifer was in Farmington. So around November, I think before Thanksgiving, we had a break. So I came to visit her. And before I was coming, I asked her, have you found any church around that we could attend? And we were having a conversation as to where we could be and start a church or start fellowship. And she was like, almost all the churches here is like white churches. Like, I don't think we can find a church here. And I said, okay, maybe we can see a Presbyterian church around. Then she said, yes, I found one Presbyterian church. One thing we didn't do was to go to the church's website and Google. We just said, okay, let's come and visit. So we entered, and it was right after the call to worship. So we sat at the corner there, and before the prayer of confession, Pastor Collins said, whoever you are, however you have come, you are welcome. And everybody was white. So I told Jennifer that, is he saying this because of us? So I rushed to speak to Pastor Colin after the sermon that day because I fell in love with the sermon he gave. I really loved the leadership, the way he was singing and preaching. And I was also at the moment in my studies, I was looking for mentorship. I was looking for a place to do my supervised ministry. So after the sermon, I told Jennifer that I have to speak to him. But I was surprised when I approached him. He received me as if he almost knew me already. And that really warmed my heart. And it wasn't just him. It was the entire congregation. We were welcomed with open arms, warm smiles, and overwhelming sense of love. I remember as soon as I started my supervised ministry, the COVID started. It was during the time of the COVID. But I still remember how how much love the church showed us by organizing a baby shower for us in front of the church. People came, drive-through to celebrate with us, to greet us. That was something we didn't have any idea about. It was like a cultural shock. Because in Ghana, for example, you only more or less celebrate the baby after she is born. But when Pastor Colin emailed me about the decision of the church, I didn't know what it was, but I was happy and overwhelmed. We were so happy about the love that we received. We are happy by the reception that you all have given us, and it has been nothing short of remarkable. In a world that sometimes feels divided, our church has demonstrated the power of faith and love to unite us all, regardless of our backgrounds or skin color. I have witnessed firsthand the true spirit of Christianity in this place. A spirit that transcends any differences and unites us as one family under God's grace. Over the years, I have grown not only in my faith, but also in my understanding of the beauty of diversity within the body of Christ. Our unity in worship and our shared commitment to living out Christ's teaching have been a source of inspiration for me. I have learned that our differences are not barriers, but opportunities to enrich our understanding of God's love. As we reflect on the years gone, and most importantly, as we look forward to the future, let us continue to embrace one another with open hearts and open minds. Let us be a beacon of love and acceptance in our community, showing the world that the love of Christ knows no bounds. I want to thank everyone for the incredible reception you have given to us and for making us feel like cherished members of this community. I'm excited to see where God will lead us in the coming years, and I'm grateful to be on this journey with you all. May God bless our church, our congregation, and our commitment to love one another, as God has loved us. Thank you, and happy anniversary to all.
In 225 years, the second longest serving pastor of this congregation is with us today. Alan Presby, come. Share with us.
I want you to know that it is truly, truly wonderful to be here today to celebrate this with you. 225 years is a long time. And between Colin and I, we have 33 of it, or 34 of it, or 35 of it. So we're part of that wonderful story now, and that's great. Now, I want you to know that I've been looking forward to this for quite a long time. I am the block in the quilt. That's the middle block with the circle. That was Susie's work. And I was the pastor here when we celebrated in 1998. And I have kept the shirt. I've kept the shirt for a special occasion. Most of my t-shirts get worn out very quickly. This one has been tucked away for a special occasion, and it has arrived, and it is today. So I'm just going to leave the shirt open. Now, my remarks are going to be much less like a sermon. Thank you, brother. And it's great to meet you and to know what this church has been for you. This church, for Susie and I, was our home for 17 years. We raised both of our children in Victor. Amy is now in Sagertown, Pennsylvania, which is about 30 miles south of Erie. David is still in the area, living in Fairport. Victor was a very important piece of our lives, and this church was at the heart of that. The story about how I came here is, by the way, all this stuff is anecdotal, okay? So I was on the staff of Mission at the Eastward in Maine. There were 4 of us who were pastoring 12 churches between us. I had been up there after leaving Webster in 1979. I went to Maine to be on the staff of the mission. I was there 4 years, and we did a lot of social ministry. We worked with low-income folks. Our churches were tiny. And I began to feel like I wanted to do something that put me in a larger church situation with more of the things going on that I was sort of trained to do in seminary. So I was feeling like the walls in Maine were starting to close in on me a little bit. And on a snowy January morning, I sat down in the manse by the wood stove in the kitchen where we lived in Maine. And I put the paperwork in front of me to start filling out the pastor's information form. And this is an awful thing to have to do. Fill out all these forms. Try to count the letters that you're allowed to write to explain who you are, And I'm starting to break into a sweat about this as I sit there in the kitchen. And the phone rang. Literally, this is the way it happened. The phone rang, and it was Tom Ferguson, who was the co-chair of the pastor nominating committee at this church in 1983. And he said, "You may not know anything about us, but we've heard a little bit about you, and we think that you might be a good match for us in Victor. Would you consider sending us your information?" Yes, I will. And so I very quickly threw together a PIF. I prayed over it some, and oh my goodness, sent it to them. And the long and short of the story is that I was called here as the pastor in 1983. It must have been the work of the Spirit. I remember well some of the folks that were on that committee, Tom Ferguson, Ruth Dresty, Paul Stewart was co-chair of that committee. And we moved here from Maine in a U-Haul, and it snowed, and we had to come over, out of Massachusetts, out of the hills. We got here. Anyway, it was the beginning of 17 years of, for me and for Susie, a wonderful relationship with this congregation. 17 years is a long time to be any place as a pastor. But they were all wonderful years. There were some rough spots along the way, and I've noticed as I've watched the presentation today how emphasis has changed in the church between my pastorate and Colin's. I'm very impressed with how amazingly hands-on your mission is now. When I was pastor here, we were involved in mission, but it was typically through our denomination's special kind of appeals, one great hour of sharing, the Christmas joy offering, those kind of things. Your ministry here now obviously is much more hands-on. Good things are happening that you are involved in personally, and I just think that that's what the Christian walk is all about. So I'm very, very thrilled to see that happening in this congregation. One of the things that was mentioned is that the leadership in churches over the years is so important. I had in this church some of the best elders, some of the best servants of the church and of the gospel of any place that I've ever been. Colin had some of these same people. Dave Henderson helped set up this program. Jan Astles, I think, is still involved with the Sunday school program. Linda Smith. Do you know that Linda Smith, ever since I've left here, sends me a book on my birthday every year? I have a Linda Smith shelf in my library. And the things she picks, oh my goodness, good stuff. Those people were important when I was here as the pastor, they were important for Colin, and they will continue to be important. This is the continuity that you were talking about in leadership. There was a lot of that in this congregation. Pretty amazing. The wonderful person that served here as my secretary for many years is sitting back there, you know. The people are what make a church, the faith that they bring to what they do is the power behind the Spirit in churches. And I can see it happening here. It's still happening in spite of the fact that it's harder and harder to find people to volunteer and to get involved. It's happening here, and that's a wonderful kind of thing. We had some wonderful things that we tried here. Some of them worked for a while, some of them didn't. We did Logos program here for a number of years. That was an after-school program that brought kids down from the school and had a weekday program for them. For a while, we had a second service, a couple of years. We started an early service, and it was a weekly communion service. We had communion every week. We finally went back to one service because we didn't feel we were big enough to sort of feel like we were a full congregation if we were split between 8:30 and 11 or 10:30, or whatever time our worship was. And it was a fascinating experience because it was a 45-minute service, and a lot of our membership in that period of time that was new were what I call Roman Catholic retreads. People who had had a falling out with the Catholic Church for some reason ended up coming to us, and they came to that service because it was every week communion. They were still Catholics, you know? You can't get it out of your system if that's the way you're raised. So it was a wonderful time here. Wonderful people, wonderful support, particularly at the end, which was very hard for my family because Susie was terminally ill with a brain tumor. And the support we had here as we were making a move in the middle of that difficult family crisis was wonderful. The support where we went to was wonderful when we got there. And I'll never forget what you folks did for my family. There was a service for Susie in Unadilla on a Saturday, and there was a service here for Susie the following Tuesday. The choir from Webster, where I had served first, joined with the choir from this church to sing together. I think my friend Val was involved in that service. And Susie taught at Siena Academy in Rochester, and all her colleagues from that school were here. People from Webster came. Victor supported it, and it was just so moving. And then we were off to New Life, and Susie passed away in 2001. And I'll tell you the story because it's kind of crazy how the Spirit works. After that service here on a Tuesday, I went up to Maine with my son David, and we just kind of debriefed and were together for 3 or 4 days. Then I went out to Indiana, Illinois, where Amy was living with Mark. Was there for a week, came back to Unadilla, and got involved right away on a Monday evening where the women were having a chicken and biscuit dinner. And I kind of was numb, but I went to that event, poured coffee, said hello to people, got their best wishes, had my fill of people after about an hour, went into the kitchen, went next to the sink to start rinsing and drying dishes, and Carol was washing dishes. She wasn't a member of the church, but she came and she worked with a women's group. I'd never met her before. And we talked. She had been widowed for 10 years. And we talked there at the sink for an hour and a half. She tells me she left that night and she went on her way home. She said, if I have to wait 5 years, I'm going to marry that guy. Well, it happened. So it's amazing how things happen. You would never script your own life journey the way it turns out. The journeys that we have as we go through life, as we make our decisions, as we make our plans, and God smiles. If you wrote the script, you couldn't write it. You couldn't write it the way it turns out. You just couldn't. So anyway, I love this church. I love this congregation. The Victor experience for me, faith-wise, will be a huge part always of who I am. And now I want to tell you 2 anecdotal things, and then I'll get away from the mic. At the first presentation this morning, there was a comment that somewhere in the church records it says you couldn't pay the pastor with whiskey. I have 2 whiskey-related stories to tell you which have to do with this congregation. On a Christmas Day, Susie and I invited Victor and Marie Parmenter to dinner. And they came. They were delighted to come. And Victor came in and he handed me a 5th of whiskey. And he said, I understand Presbyterian ministers like good sipping whiskey. The second whiskey story I want to tell you involves Jenny Webster. Jenny, I took communion to Jenny a number of times as she was older. And I always took it kind of, I didn't have one of these kind of funny little kits, where it looks like a doctor's bag, thing. It looks very, I don't know, they don't fit for me. So I always took my communion stuff in a basket. And when I took it to Jenny, she was concerned that I didn't have a proper container to have the grape juice in. Okay. She never voiced that, but she felt that. And one Christmas, I got from her a little package with a whiskey flask in it. And it had the Presbyterian logo engraved on the outside of it. And Jenny had an incredible story about shopping for this. Somebody, maybe it was one of her kids, I don't know, had taken her all over looking for a proper thing to put the communion wine or whiskey in, the communion grape juice. And she had some crazy stories about going into these shops, as by that time I think she was in her 80s, looking for a flask. But anyway, I got this flask, and it's got the Presbyterian logo on it, and it's the one I use, and it always breaks the ice. Well, and the other thing that I wanted to share with you, I met a fellow person who spent time in Maine who was here earlier. That was Muriel Nadeau. And I remember something Muriel said about my ministry. She didn't say it to me, but she said it to somebody else, and it got to me secondhand. She said, he wears pretty well on us. That's the way she described my ministry. He wears pretty well on us. Well, I guess if you're with a congregation 17 years, you better figure out how to wear well on each other. You know, it helps. It helps to kind of get along. Well, enough for me. You're a wonderful congregation, a wonderful church. There was love here shared for my family. There's clearly love in the work that you are doing now right here in your community. You're about, I think, to get a new pastor. I think that's about to happen, hopefully, for you. And I'm sure that you will continue to be a blessing as a congregation to that new leader, that new spiritual leader who will come here to help you walk the walk, help you stay true to your faith, challenge you, move you out of your comfort zone. So as you make that transition, I am with you in spirit. Blessings on you and on your future. Okay.
I did learn once that in the 1700s in New Jersey, Baptist ministers often made their living by selling rums. So, you know, things do change. Marie Hanselman wanted to be here today, could not, but she did send a few thoughts that she wanted us to read. So let me read from Marie Hanselman. She quotes this song that we all know: "The church is not a building, the church is not a steeple, the church is not a resting place, the church is the people." These words by Avery and Marsh ring so true in my life and in my connection with the First Presbyterian Church of Victor, New York. So many followers of Jesus at First Presbyterian touched my life. She names quite a few others and then some more here. All these people and so many more prepared me for the challenging journey of life in the years that would follow. Reverend Alan Presby, Jan Astles, Linda Hicks, as I struggled with a difficult romantic relationship and a bout of depression. Alton Corbett, Reverend Alan Presby, and many choir members were with her as my mother underwent heart surgery and died on December 18th, just a few days before Christmas. Those who accompanied me a few years later as I discerned a call to ministry and went off to Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. She recently retired from the John Calvin Presbyterian Church in Henrietta, where she said, "I served as part-time stated supply pastor for about 10 years. God has called me to various forms of ministry and challenged me to continue to grow as Jesus reached out through me in a multitude of people-to-people relationships. I am grateful for the strong foundation that the people of the First Presbyterian Church in Victor so lovingly built for me in the wondrous journey of life in the kingdom of God here on earth as it is in heaven. Congratulations on this anniversary. I know that God is not finished working through each one of you even now. Peace, Reverend Marie Hanselman." I wish she could have been here. The third longest serving minister in 225 years. Colin, come and take however much time you want, I guess, and because you're the last on the list here. Close out our time together this afternoon.
So the church is old, but God is older. Yeah. And the reason for the church is as old as that. I was looking up at this pulpit while predecessors of mine were speaking, and knowing that there's someone who will be coming to fill this space in the weeks ahead. And I was reminded just exactly how short this little pulpit is, right? I was thrilled to be here for as long as I was in so many ways that it was really good. And I got to tell you, I was told the story of the historicity of this pulpit and that it was refinished and put here. And look at me. It's the wrong size. But the reason for the pulpit is just right, and always has been. To speak some words of hope to a world that needs it, to gather and to send. And really, that's the piece I wanted to reflect on with you all this particular day. Gathering and sending. When the church was founded, it really was founded as a gathering place, because folks were kind of far between. They were sort of founding a country, and they were building their own little plots of agricultural land, and they needed a central space to gather. That's where you could hear the word. That's where you could look for a wife, right? That's where you could hear all the gossip. That's where you got Netflix and could continue scrolling to see what's happening in the world. It was the gathering place for what was at one time a sparsely populated rural community. Folks would come here, and all the stuff that was interesting would happen here. And the church served its role very well as a gathering space. There's a reason there's a bell up top. It's not just to say, hey, guess what? It's time for worship. It's also to say, hey, pay attention, something might be on fire. Hey, there's a reason why we all need to come to a space that we all can find and have a conversation we need to have as a community. The founding of the church was primarily one of gathering. And then generation after generation after generation passed, until we got to a spot where I was a kid who was a child of divorce, and my father lived in Canandaigua, New York, and my mother lived in Rochester, New York. And do you know what's between Canandaigua and Rochester? That'd be Victor, New York. And so the route to go visit Dad for the weekend came down Main Street, Victor. We would go to Middle Cheshire Road when I was a middle school student. And I remember Victor at that time being this random collection of a couple of cool old shops. We would go to the Cheshire shop, the Cheshire store, and mostly it was farmland. I had absolutely no idea that later I would be the pastor here, and what was once farmland is now housing developments. That's a big change. But when I was of that age, so now we're talking the late 70s and 80s, this space was still very much a gathering space as the world was beginning to shift and change and grow around it. It was still at the tail end of Christendom when gathering was something that people really did. The most effective model of church was often people coming together. They would have the Sabbath and keep it holy. They would do traditional worship and programmings. They didn't have cell phones, right? And so even then, when I was but a boy, this place served very well as a central gathering space. It did its job, and it did its job well. Somewhere in the midst of all of this, we reoriented the direction of the sanctuary because we're just radical. It's still a pretty traditional building, right? And yet it serves its space. And then the world started to change a lot. The world started to change profoundly. That change was massive cultural and part of all of what was happening in Western Christendom in the United States. Distractions became more easy. The opportunity to get what church used to provide became much more accessible in places other than church. Things like, oh, here we go, we're going to practice sports on Sunday morning. Anybody want to complain about that? Everybody wants to complain about that, right? I remember stores weren't even open on Sunday. I know. Massive cultural change. And paralleling that massive, broader cultural change was local transformation of the Victor community itself. What was once a bunch of fields, I didn't know that I happened to be driving past the Olney fields when I was going to see my dad, but that's what I was doing. now became housing developments. Most of those housing developments were not at a price point that would have been possible for most of the historic residents of Victor to purchase. Now we've gone from making it work, kind of rural, nice little town where folks would go to the white church on Main Street that would ring the bell and they'd find out what they needed to find out, to this thing that we call a suburb. When I first got here in 2004, I once described Victor as a budding suburb, and a couple of people, not here, but here, were offended by the term. Let me ask you now that it's 2023, can we acknowledge that Victor is the fastest growing and one of the most desirable housing market suburbs of Rochester, New York? It's changed. What's gathered now in this community is not people into this congregation or even any established religious institution in Victor. If you do the math on how many people go to any religious service on any given week compared to the total population of Victor, you will cry. But people have gathered into the land that makes up Victor very, very much. I know, I just sold a house here. It's not that hard to sell a house in Victor because people really want to move into Victor. So the community has gathered. But what then of the church? This church had generations, actually at this point centuries, of good and appropriate service as a space of gathering, of bringing people in to communicate good life and good word. And now it has an opportunity to continue that good work. It only needs reorient its direction. The gathering here is now not just to the sanctuary, the protection of a space from all the challenges of the outside world, and instead becomes sort of a training center to launch people out into that world that needs the message that has always been true in this place and at this far too small pulpit. It is extraordinary what God has done and how many beautiful people have maintained this place in time. Many of you know that I have worked in church assessment stuff and worked in the national level of pieces. And frankly, the statistical reality of the First Presbyterian Church in Victor would not indicate that it should still be here. And I'm talking from 100 years ago, not just your generation. There was never enough people or enough money for this place to make sense, to sustain as well and as beautifully and as impactfully as it has for what is now multiple centuries. And the fact of the matter is, you wouldn't even have the chance to be the saints of the current generation of this congregation were it not for the ongoing blessing of the Lord we all touch, and the one that we are all touched by. Do you know that there was a Linda Smith before there was a Linda Smith? There was some wonderful woman 150 years ago that's in the minutes of a record that may have burned up when they tried to preserve them. Some of you remember that story, right? Did you know that there was a Lou Stewart before there was a Lou Stewart? Somebody who came and fixed stuff and didn't tell you he was coming and scares the crap out of you when he shows up at like 9 o'clock at night? Just wandering in, I'm just doing stuff. Okay, man. He scared me so bad so many times the first years I was here until I realized if he shows up, something's getting fixed. And no, we didn't vote on it. You know? And that's been going on for 200 years. People who mimic and mirror the saints of the current congregation have been present for centuries because God has been at work in this place that whole time. The puzzle pieces necessary to sustain even an extraordinary change have been sufficient to hold this space true for this long. How beautiful that is. What is this church going to look like in 225 years? Statistically, I'm going to suggest it's very unlikely that this sanctuary and facility stays in place 225 years from now. That's not sad. Because if anybody wants to change the windows on a 400-year-old sanctuary, that is a waste of the resources of God's good people at that given time. But the reason for this pulpit, the story that has been shared, and the need in humanity for the truth of Jesus as the Christ will remain true then, even as it is present now. And thanks be to God that this place, these people, and that witness has been true this long. And so, as the most recent past installed pastor of this place, let me just share this word. It is a word of huge thanks for nurturing a slightly green and very exuberant pastor into someone who's heavier and slower and maybe a little more thoughtful, for nurturing not just Alan's family, but mine. You have touched generations of people who are now still good people in the world. Thank you for the gifts provided here and the lessons learned here. And as you go forward, let me encourage you to go to the very first days of the church, which was all about being apostolic. They didn't have much space to gather, but what they had was a world that needed them. This church has more in common with the first days of the first church ever than it does perhaps with the church you have known for the past few generations. And what a gift it is to be able to take up that mantle, to imagine that possibility and reclaim that work, to go and be disciples in the world. Yes, you can still gather here. Thanks be to God for that. But now, more than ever, what the world needs and what I believe God is most likely calling you to is to get sent from this place to the people who have come to the land that was once farm and is now their homes, to tell them the story that has always been true. This pulpit will not be the right size for many, but the story told here is exactly the right one for all. Thank you for your witness. Thank you for following our Holy One. Thank you for being the saints of the current generation. And as you have heard me say for nearly 20 years in this space, get out of here. Go and tell the world of the Christ you have met here. And now Linda wants us to sing.
Got the whole world in his hands, got the whole world in his with thee.